Hello and welcome to Modernity. So this lecture is going to talk about how modernization has reshaped psychology. Okay, so this might all seem vaguely familiar because it's kind of part of the cultural water that we swim in, but the modern view has the self as very independent. So a fancy word for that is we're atomistic. We tend to think that the world is made up of individual selves, and those are kind of the building blocks of everything. So, in other words, it's not so much about the relations, it's about who we are each as individuals. This ties into what we're going to call moral sources in a later lecture, where we tend to valorize or value utilitarian individualism. So we think really highly of entrepreneurs because they go out there and as individuals accomplish something. Or we think about a self-made man or a self-made person. Um, and we get excited about technology that lets us do new things like iPhones. And we are also invested in expressive individualism. So most of us think there's something inside us that's unique to who we are that we need to express or show to other people to really be who we fully are. So we'll talk more about those themes later, but if you just, as a quick snapshot, think about therapy, which is something those of us who are interested in psychology might think about. It's a very modern kind of concept. There's a focus on the self, it's this inward kind of focus. It has this ideal of adjustment or fulfillment, and it has a utilitarian and expressive angle. Utilitarian because there's a certain number of steps or sessions you go through to achieve a new way of doing something. Specifically, think about cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a very mechanistic kind of approach to things. And then the expressive angle, where as individuals we are trying to figure out what's inside us so that we can express it and show other people who we are and get in touch with what our true feelings are. So, what's the response of psychology to global warming? We can also see some modernity functioning here. I think in general, the field has been slow to recognize its importance. It's been slow to understand how the way we think about psychology and who we are impacts the way we use the planet, the way we interact with nature. And it's, I think, primarily because psychology understands the self as this thing that's internal and that's separate, and it's not necessarily connected to anything else. So concerns about the environment seem tangential and kind of optional. Okay, so and we can contrast that modern view with the traditional view, which was more common in ancient societies or in the Middle Ages. But in those kind of situations, the self has a certain place. It's set in a certain role. So you think about some people are kings, some people are the aristocracy, and some people are the serfs. So tradition and hierarchy kind of defines where the self is, and you have the good as being something outside of the self that you're trying to get in touch with. Whereas with modernity, the idea of the good kind of becomes internalized as something that you need to achieve. Okay, and then we might be moving towards an ecological view. So understanding humans as part of this larger whole, understanding both humanity, and the self as part of these larger wholes, understanding reality as a process or it's networked. It's not necessarily hierarchical, but there's interconnections there. But it's a little bit like the traditional view in that the good is outside of the self, and you have something you're trying to get in touch with or in tune with which might be nature. So anyway, in today's lecture, we're going to try to better understand what this modern view of the self is like and what some of its implications are. Okay, so here I have the lecture outline. We're going to go through these different things, and we're going to start off with modernity, just defining it so you know what you're working with. Okay, so if you want to put it on a timeline, and a long time ago, say 2,000 years ago, whatever, we had the classics. We had the Greeks and the Romans, and there was that classical period. And then that eventually gave way to the Middle Ages, where you had the church and kings and queens and feudalism and all that kind of stuff. And then that gives way to modernity. And modernity brings about corporations and these bigger, larger bureaucratic systems that we live in, and also a very different understanding of the self. So if you want just a quick definition of modernity, you can talk about it as a period of time and an outlook that's characterized by industrialization, urbanization, a faith in progress and science, and a more atomistic, inward-looking sense of the self. All right, so just a quick overview. What's changed when we talk about modernity? So here I have a picture of, it's an idealized village, but you can imagine people were born in this village, they grew up in this village, their jobs were determined by what their fathers did. You didn't have professions, you didn't have bureaucracies, you didn't have a postal service, all that kind of stuff. And then things changed, and the huge changes that occurred from the 1600s on, we went from living in rural or smaller kinds of towns to most people living in cities, so that rural to urban shift. We went from agriculture to industrialized production, so most people used to work on farms, now most people work either manufacturing or in service industries, and we're very distant from that living off the land kind of past. Used to be very religious, and it's a lot more secular now. So even if you're religious, religious is a less dominant part of your life typically, because in part there's this thing called the nation state. So we look to government to do lots of different things, and we look to from building streets to fighting wars to all that kind of stuff. So we went from feudal to nation state. Excuse me. So here, just a few more pictures. This obviously is the Declaration of Independence, and you have these individuals enacting a new government. And this is a very modern kind of way of doing things. So they don't have a king, and they say that, you know, these truths are self-evident that we're all created equal. But it's still transitional, right? Like they're saying all men are created equal, but it's really only white, landed, rich guys that get to vote. And it's still a very hierarchical society. And they're just on the road to modernity. They're not there yet. But I love this picture in part because if you look at the guys on this beam, they're obviously building this building. It looks like in New York City. There's this combination of they can climb into the skies and reach the tips of God's fingers, and they have this kind of confidence that they can do that, but it's also there's this kind of scary abyss beneath them that they seem kind of impervious to, and that in some ways captures the modern condition. Like lots of possibilities are open, but some of those traditional structures that used to give us security have changed or are gone. Okay, so let me go back to my outline here. We've got there's five. That was the definition of modernity. Now these five key transformations of modernity. So this is just a summary of them, but we go from the Protestant Reformation up through Romanticism. And if you just want a ballpark number, around 1600 is when, 1600, 1700, when a lot of the stuff is going on. So, you know, 4 centuries ago, roughly. Okay, so number one, 1520, Martin Luther, this guy, nailed some theses to the door of a church, and he wanted to debate some things. So that wasn't that radical in itself. Monks did that all the time. But he had some propositions, and he wanted to argue about the church's authority in a way that really upset the power structures of the time. And the church went from being this monolithic thing that controlled everything to once you had Protestants and Catholics, and it started breaking things up. So this is a really old depiction of the way power worked. And you have the Pope bestowing the crown on man who would become king. So the church had a ton of power to establish authority. So it's a really big shift when the Protestant Reformation takes a lot of that away. So it used to be that people would try to speak, the churches would have services in Latin, and there's still some Catholic churches that do that today. But the idea was that there was one common language across all these different nation groups and all these different people that the sacrament was delivered in. People also, there was a big shift in that, and I have a picture here of the printing press that played a big role for that. So the printing press enabled Bibles to be printed in large numbers, and Martin Luther and other Protestants wanted people to have the Word of God in their hands so that they could read it. So before, the church was this intermediary. The church stood between an individual and God. But that's breaking down. So the services aren't in Latin anymore. They're in the local language of the people, be it French, German, or whatever. The Bibles are now in the common word. So think about that as an individual. You could hold in your hand the Word of God. That really has an impact on what we think about individuals are capable of and the value of the individual. So by accident, Martin Luther, by most modern day standards, would be considered a pretty harsh guy, almost a fascist. He was by no stretch a liberal. But once you have two people saying that this system is right or this system is right, and they're at war with each other, you get this certain respect for diversity and pluralism, or at least you have to recognize that there are people out there that disagree with you about fundamental things like the nature of God. So what happens is you get this, to use a fancy word here, this subjectivization of beliefs. So we go from we believe this to this kind of conception of this is what I believe. So most of us wouldn't think anything weird if you were brought up in a certain religious tradition, and then as you moved into adulthood, you started going to a different kind of church, or you stopped going to church, or adopted a different kind of religion. Like, it's very much up to the individual now. So you can see in some ways, Emerson, who you read for this lecture, is kind of an extension of the Protestant Reformation. He was originally a Unitarian minister, and eventually he gave that up, and he became kind of a non-theist, but he still looked to nature and other things as being very important. But you can see in his self-reliance themes how this Protestant Reformation really sets up the individual to have a lot more power and authority than it did before. All right, transformation number 2, the political revolutions. So most of you should be familiar with the 1776 revolution. That, of course, was in America. 1789 was the French Revolution, and for obviously a lot of the world and Europe, that was the one that was more notable. It also had more bloody consequences and probably a bigger impact overall. So in the political revolutions, there was a rethinking of power and rights. So originally, or at least before modernity, kings would claim that they ruled because God had given them that right. So there was this divine right of kings that people assumed was the case. And with modernity and these political revolutions, the sovereignty shifts. First of all, it's from the king to the people, and then eventually it's from people to the individual. And so, as you can see in the Bill of Rights that we have attached to our Constitution, the first 10 amendments, we have these individual rights that are viewed as inherent, inalienable, self-possessing, transcendent, and foundational. So these take on a certain dominant force in our political rhetoric and our understanding of who we are, in that we see ourselves first and foremost as formed as individuals who then come together for our collective good. I have here, so we have some recognizable figures: Thomas Jefferson, John Locke. This is a scene from a French Revolution. I also have John C. Calhoun, who is a kind of a scary looking man and had some scary ideas, but he was one of the chief defenders of slavery in the United States. And he took the individual rights to be something that the slaveholder possessed, and that the government couldn't take away and couldn't interfere with the slaveholder's property rights. So I'm suggesting that, not in any way to support slavery, but to suggest that the idea of rights doesn't necessarily lead to equality. All right, number 3, the scientific revolution, around 1600. So a few figures we have here. Your friend Darwin, the young Darwin. We have Galileo and his telescope. And you might recall from that story there was some challenging of the church's authority. Galileo actually went out and observed what the heavenly bodies were doing, and it became started to undermine some of the church's understandings of how cosmology, how the worlds worked, what revolved around what, etc. We have Benjamin Franklin, one of the founders, but also known as a scientist. He's here doing his thing with the electrical kite, trying to get killed in a thunderstorm. And we have, this is interesting, there's these cherubs, these angelic kind of figures around him. So those suggest that this idea of figuring out the world and harnessing electrical power, there's some kind of divine, larger purpose to it, where man is taking control of the universe sort of thing. That's a little different than just our idea of you plug something in the wall and it works. I also have here represented, coming out of the scientific revolution, you get a lot of technologies like the locomotive, which really changed people's sense of space and time. And coming out of the scientific revolution, just the idea of electricity, you had this phenomenon where small towns in America, when they were electrified, could take back the night, and you could have a very different kind of experience of the world in which you could operate and do things at nighttime, like in a way that you never could before. So the big takeaway from all this is, instead of looking to the ancients, instead of looking to Aristotle and Socrates and their cronies, you're looking as knowledge is something that's progressing. And we'll talk about Descartes in a little bit, but Descartes introduced these ideas of these methods and these certain ways of knowing that will give you traction, and you can then make progress. So it's a very different understanding of nature. Nature is something that becomes demysticized, disenchanted, where you're trying to control nature, and you can define nature in terms of certain reductive mechanisms. And you get this idea of knowledge. Knowledge is not like communing with God. Knowledge is this way of controlling things. It has an instrumental or utilitarian function. And of course, tightly tied to science is technology. Technology advances science, as you can see with the telescope, but also science advances technology as well. All right, and then transformation number 4, the Industrial Revolution. So you had this huge shift when factories opened up and you started burning fossil fuels, and you had these large-scale productions that pulled people out of the countryside into the city, and it caused this huge urbanization process, which for a lot of people, it was very disconcerting and overwhelming, just the crowds and the teeming masses and all the chaos. You had, for the first time, the idea of wealth. So wealth before had just been something that landowners had. If you had land, you had wealth. If you didn't, you didn't. But you had the rise of the merchant class, labor mobility, people moving around looking for jobs. So it really transformed the kind of communities you would have. So here's an idealized painting of a natural landscape in feudal times. You can see the workers are taking a break. So it's not as if they had an easy life, but they did have some control over their existence. So if you've heard of the big festival in Germany, Oktoberfest, or there's many fall festivals, which are basically modern ways of carrying on the tradition of celebrating the harvest. Because once the harvest is in, you have the food for the winter, you can take a break for a week. You can kick back for a little while. That's very different than working in a factory, where you're really there from dawn to dusk and subjected to the rigors of working with a mechanized world. And there's this dark side where, as I have pictured here, children were brought in and damaged and not educated. And there's a way in which the Industrial Revolution kind of takes people as inputs and doesn't give them more power initially. But anyway, in the long run, the Industrial Revolution has this great individualizing effect because it moves people around and it breaks up the communities before that were tied to the land. All right, then the last transformation we'll talk about is Romanticism. And so romantic is something where you kind of have an emotional or an idealized perspective on something. Romanticism is a certain movement that is part of modernity, but is also a reaction against modernity. So it's coming on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, and it's people saying, you know, you've kind of disenchanted nature, and that's not a good thing. Nature has some kind of higher purpose. In some ways, there might be a deeper truth in nature in which previous generations will look to God, now the Romantics might look to nature. But they were also very skeptical of the kind of factory life and the kind of industrialized, rationalized, that kind of approach to things, utilitarian approach that kind of sucked the joy out of living and homogenized things and didn't respect intuition and aesthetics and all that kind of stuff. So there's this attention to the emotions, to the affective experience. There's a certain anti-rationalism. Now, this might sound soft and fuzzy, and I have Walt Whitman pictured here because he would be an exemplar of a romantic thought, or what we might call expressive individualism, where he's talking about, I have many selves, and he's very into his intuitive experience. But there's also a potential for kind of a dark side. You can see that in the Nazi movement, where they came up with some of these very emotionally based approaches, romantic kind of understanding of who they were as a people. So self-determination can be this way in which people are set free, and it also can be a way in which people can dominate other people in terms of seeking their own self-determination. But you can certainly see in a lot of products that we sell today in our consumer culture that there's this idea that certain devices, here's an ancient device called an iPod, precursor of your phone with all your music on it. But you can see the individual here is expressing themselves in a certain kind of way by the music they listen to. So there's a way in which we can sell products by convincing people that it'll help them have a deeper, more meaningful life because they can express themselves and listen to their music, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's it for the five key transformations of modernity. Next, we'll turn to Descartes. Descartes, I'm going to pitch to you as Mr. Modernity. There's actually a lot of interesting, really valuable stuff that Descartes did. I'm going to kind of paint him as a boogeyman for our purposes today, and suggest how he laid some of the tracks that have led to some of the problems that we have today. But that's kind of unfair, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Descartes, you could see for sure this inward shift that is a hallmark of modernity. So instead of looking to the ancients or looking to the patterns in the universe that show God's hand, Descartes starts with the proposition, I think, therefore I am. So he builds this whole cosmology, this way of looking at the world, trying to build from his own experience out. And that really starts a whole way of looking at the world that's more based on the self. So if you contrast that, if you remember Plato's cave, where people are distracted by these illusions and their mission is to escape from the cave and orient themselves towards the sun, which is the truth. That kind of ancient vision is truth is outside of you, but Descartes is looking inward. So reason becomes this tool, this thing that we can use to advance our goals. So if you think about like an engineer, the way an engineer uses reason, it's not to contemplate God's wonder, or it's not to become more attuned with the universe. It's for a very instrumental utilitarian purpose. So there's this rejection of reason, or this kind of passive, contemplative, genteel kind of notion of reason. And it's like, let's get down and dirty with nature and figure out how she works. So there's this great quote, we may find a practical philosophy to render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. So when Descartes is writing in the 1600s, modern medicine hadn't come about, modern technologies, the fossil fuel revolution of the Industrial Revolution. So I understand that we could master nature might sound like a good idea. When you live in our age, when there's nuclear weapons and we're taking the tops off of mountains to strip soil out of the ground, when the earth is warming and the sea levels are going to rise and all kinds of species are going to go extinct, you might see that that way of thinking of trying to control and possess nature has led us to a point where we've kind of killed nature. So there's a famous environmental book called The End of Nature, where Bill McKibben, a well-known environmental thinker, makes the argument that nature is this independent thing that stands outside of our influence, has kind of ceased to exist, that anywhere on Earth you can already see our influences. So just a quick aside, I'm going to talk about Cartesian thinking in the next slide. Cartesian is just a transfiguration of the word Descartes. So the Cartesian view, if we want to pick on it, is one in which it's very much based in dualism and disengagement. So what happens is we objectify the world. The world becomes this thing that we can probe with our minds. So there's this divide between the body that is physical and less important and this higher order thing, which is the mind. So it kind of echoes the idea that God is the most important thing, and then there's the world outside of that, outside of God. But it's this dualism, the separation, that leads to a certain way of thinking about the world that, for example, tends to have us separate emotions from reason. So in this objectifying view of the world becomes disenchanted. So whereas before we would look to nature and understand it as kind of God's handwriting, now it's just a set of mechanisms that we can seek to control. And we reject that natural order, the teleology of the world. So if you think back to Disney's Lion King, for example, there's this idea that there's this circle of life and the lions are on top and they're kings just like kings of humans rule kingdoms. Lions are the king of the natural order. So there's this way in which the ancients or the folks in the medieval era would look to nature as containing a certain kind of natural order. Well, in the Enlightenment and in modernity, it all gets turned to just stuff that we can make machines out of and stuff that we can control. And so that might make us less inclined to appreciate what's in nature. There's also this form of what's called disengaged reasoning that starts to take hold, where we want to become objective, we want to reject passion. So if you've ever heard the expression when somebody says, be reasonable, what they're suggesting is really reason should be the dominant form of processing things, and that our emotions should be controlled. So we get this idea that free will, the thinker, the independence and self-control that disengaged reasoning can give us, starts to take on a life of its own. And so reason becomes this method, this tool, this way of controlling things that can have a lot of downsides. So for example, reason brought about certain things that are great, like modern medicine, but reason also brought about things like the industrial mechanisms that are causing global warming and the kind of technologies that produce the atom bomb and the arms race, which most people would say, taken as a collective, is anything but reasonable. Okay, so Cartesian knowing, it's this form of seeking control. So if you think about it, what does it mean to know something? So there's a way in which our modern conception of knowing is about control, instrumentality, completeness, competency. So you think about calling something a fossil fuel, what we're doing is we're taking the carcasses of little teeny organisms that used to live in an ocean. We're taking their physical remains and we're making a fuel out of it. So we don't approach that stuff as these are remnants of an earlier time, or these are some of our biological cousins that have gone before us. It's just fuel. It's just stuff that we can use. And you see this in the same term, natural resources. The earth becomes something that's just a set of what one philosopher called a standing reserve. It's just stuff in a closet that we can use. It doesn't have any meaning on its own. So we get this technology that produces this means-end relationship where we're not inclined to try to understand how are we part of this larger world? What's the meaning of the larger world? It's just stuff that we can use. So the big takeaway, the critique of Descartes or Cartesian thinking, is that it gives this ideal of control and mastery that can get us in trouble when we might, instead of trying to control nature, think about how we can learn from nature, mimic nature, and get attuned to it. All right, so that was Descartes as Mr. Modernity. We're now going to jump to some of the hallmarks of modernity, just some of the key things the feelings that it has. So I always think